Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here with us this evening for what's going to be a very fascinating conversation. I promise you. I've spent some time with Eric and Marc in Tech Run and in the green room just now, and they are both not just fascinating people, but also really nice people. So I think we're going to have a great evening. I'm glad that so many of you are chiming in, letting us know in the chat where you are from. And Mallory, it's great to see you checking in from Elmira. Hi. So I'm not going to talk for very long. I just have a little bit of housekeeping to do before I introduce our guests. And before I say anything more, I want to say that, here in Hartford last night, we had some pretty severe thunderstorms. And both Marc and Eric are on the West Coast, and there have been some issues there too. So Marc is talking to us under not the very best tech situation. And Eric also had a little bit of a tech issue earlier today. So I say that all by way of explaining that if things go awry, we will roll with the punches and do our best. But just be aware that we're coming into this program with a couple of challenges at the get-go. Having said that, let me just remind you that the chat is a great place for you to continue chatting with one another. The chat remains live even after this program is recorded and posted on our website. So if you make friends here or want to continue a conversation that you begin here, please feel free to do that. People do all the time. However, we are going to do a Q&A session toward the end of our program. And if you do have a question for Eric or Marc, or both of them, if you'd be so kind as to post that in that Ask a Question area that's at the bottom of your screen. That makes it a lot easier for us to keep track of the questions when that part of the program comes up. Also, if you take a look there later in the program, you can see what questions others have posed, and perhaps you'll agree that one of them is a question that you'd like to hear an answer to. And so you can just upvote it, and that kind of moves it up to the top of the queue. So that's how that all works. While we're looking at that part of the screen, I just draw your attention to that green button that's right below my face. It says Birdies for Charity adds 15% to your donation. We at the Mark Twain House are thrilled that we are finally open again on a limited basis for our guided house tour. And if you have not been able to come to Hartford to tour Mark Twain's house, I encourage you to do so as soon as you can. It's a wonderful experience that has not been available to the public for much of the past year. And that has meant also that we've been without our major source of revenue during the past year, our guided house tour admissions fees. And it's been tricky. It's been a hard year for us all. The staff has been furloughed 1 day a week, myself included, my executive director included. And we have been really buoyed by donations from people like yourselves who have taken part in our virtual programs and appreciated what we've been offering and showed that appreciation by sharing whatever they are able to share. So now's a particularly good time to show your generosity because the Birdies for Charity aspect of the Travelers Golf Championship does in fact add 15% to every donation that's made during this time if you follow that link. And that's a huge difference to us, and you should feel good that your dollars are stretched that much farther as well. Another thing I want to draw your attention to, and I will repaste this in the chat, but the very first entry in the chat is a link offering you the opportunity to purchase Eric Berkowitz's wonderful book, Dangerous Ideas, about which we're going to be speaking this evening. Now, obviously, we know that you can purchase this book elsewhere. We're not dummies, but if you do buy it through us, first of all, you get a signed copy, which is not common, and also you have the benefit of knowing that your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. And again, we appreciate and put to very good use every single penny. So on behalf of the staff and the trustees of the museum, let me thank you in advance for doing all these things you can to help us. If you haven't seen it yet, this book got a fantastic review in the Economist just now, and so you want to check that out. I'm sure you'll want to buy it if you don't want to already after we have our conversation tonight with our guests, whom I'm going to introduce to you right now. We're thrilled to have with us, I'm going to say one more thing. I want to thank our sponsors before I introduce Eric and Marc. Programs at the Mark Twain House and Museum are generously supported by the Wish You Well Foundation and also by Connecticut Public WNPR. And this program is produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord, who was one of our beloved trustees who recently passed away. So we very deeply appreciate that support. And now let me introduce Eric Berkowitz and Marc Cooper. Marc is a retired journalist and a retired USC journalism professor with 45 years of global experience. He's written 3 nonfiction books, including the LA Times bestseller Pinochet and Me, a Chilean anti-memoir. He's been a contributing editor to The Nation magazine since 1995 and a special global correspondent for The Village Voice in its heyday. His work has appeared in dozens of venues, from the Los Angeles Times to the New Yorker, Harper's, The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, LA Weekly, The Guardian, CBS News, and PBS Frontline. That's pretty impressive. So we're glad to have Marc with us this evening. We're also, of course, very glad to have Eric Berkowitz, a writer, lawyer, and journalist. Before devoting his practice to public interest and asylum law, he practiced media, intellectual property, and business litigation in Los Angeles. Berkowitz has published widely throughout his career, and his writing has appeared in periodicals such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, the Los Angeles Times, and LA Weekly. His previous books include Sex and Punishment and The Boundaries of Desire, and he lives in San Francisco. So we're delighted to have them both with us this evening. I'm going to bring them both on screen, and I hope you'll join me in giving a great big Mark Twain House welcome to Marc Cooper and Eric Berkowitz. It takes a second. You know how these things go. Hello. Welcome, Marc and Eric. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be in Mark Twain's house, be it virtually or not, something I have long wanted to do, but I'm several thousand miles away. So,
well, we'll talk about that at the end of the program. I'm gonna disappear now. I'll see you when it's time for Q&A, and I'm gonna sit back and enjoy your conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Hi, Eric.
Hey, Marc.
What I want to do and give our audience a head. Your book is a great. I've reread it now a second time. It's a wonderful history of censorship globally. So I want to touch on that, and then, as I told Eric before the interview, I want to bring most of what he's done up to the present. So that both enlarges the discussion, and second, it gives you, the listener, a good reason to buy the book, because we're not going to retread the whole book here. We're going to spin off from the book. But let's go into the book first, Eric. Your subtitle talks about censorship and from the ancients to fake news. So is there such thing as ancient fake news, or what is I was fascinated, at least by your story, your opening story of the Emperor Shen of China, who seemed to be quite a zealous censor. Why don't you fill us in on that, just so we know that censorship is a long, old tradition.
Yeah, censorship, I think we could probably trace censorship to the first use of language. As soon as people started speaking, they started trying to shut each other up. And as soon as power began to hear what the less powerful were saying, particularly if it impinged on their power at all or questioned them, then they immediately began to use their power to try and shut that down. So fake news, well, if we think of fake news in the way that Donald Trump called fake news, which is news that he didn't like, we could talk about the first Chinese emperor. We're now back in the third century BC, and this is Emperor Qin, who was quite a character. I mean, he was a warrior. He unified the 7 kingdoms of China. He started the wall. He instituted basic weights and measures. He was an astounding person, but he was hated badly. He was a brutal man, and he also was obsessed with the idea that history had to start with him. Okay, so the world that preceded him was per se a question of him, particularly philosophy, Confucian scholars, etc. And he actually traveled around the kingdom in disguise, and it drove him berserk, hearing intellectuals, learned people compare his kingdom to the past, which they idealized. So in order to erase that past, he decided to erase any trace of it. And he gathered every piece of philosophy, literature, poetry, particularly Confucian philosophy, and as much as he could, he destroyed it, all while keeping copies for himself. For good measure, he took 400 Confucian scholars and buried them alive. So from that point forward, anyone who invoked philosophy in a way to compare to him would get buried alive or killed with their families. Of course, this highlights another theme, which is that which we'll get to, I'm sure, which is that censorship doesn't work.
Well, actually, that was immediately going to be my second question. After you've surveyed hundreds of years of censorship and attempts at censorship, I have to assume that in the short run, it must work. It might work for X amount of time, but your book is entitled Dangerous Ideas. So you can shut somebody up, but do the censors usually have any success in eradicating the ideas, or do they resurface always?
Well, censorship certainly didn't work for those scholars he buried alive, and it certainly didn't work for him, because he ended up dying, drinking an elixir of life just a couple years after he did this. And the books that he saved persisted. No, in short, censorship really, really doesn't work. If we look at censorship as an idea, I mean, as the attempt to squelch an idea, okay, censorship will certainly get in the way of the lives of those who are jailed, certainly get in the way of the lives of those who are killed, and certainly get rid of a lot of copies. But what it does, it's the Streisand effect, okay? It almost invariably creates the notion of forbidden fruit. Right. And so, you know, a piece of writing that is censored will invariably go for a higher price. It's almost impossible to get rid of all copies. So copies will always stay. And so, you know, instantly, let's jump ahead 15 centuries. We have, you know, the printing press invented. All of a sudden, what was kept in just a few manuscripts is now available to the masses. Instantly, censorship laws proliferated. And instantly, writers were told to write anything that would be forbidden. Why? Of course. I mean, honestly, that's what publishers told them. Write anything that would be forbidden. Why? Because the banned in Boston, this is forbidden, this is under the table, it simply doesn't work. And in fact, what it does is it makes the ideas that are attempted to be forbidden that much more credible, that much, that, you know, if Emperor Xin didn't like it, something's got to be right with it. In fact, French censors in the 18th century stopped burning books in public because doing so only juiced sales. I mean, I can give a few more examples. I think they're worthwhile. I mean, in the 17th century, for example, Algernon Sidney is an aristocrat, got in hock with the King Charles II of England. He was a very strong opponent of him. Charles II didn't like it. They invaded his house. They arrested him for treason. The problem with treason is that you've got to have some proof. They didn't have any proof. But what they did find was something in his drawer that he had never published, that no one had ever seen, called Discourses Concerning Government. It basically said that the government has a responsibility to the people, and if it doesn't meet that responsibility, they're allowed to revolt. Well, they used that piece of writing against him as evidence of his treason. And it was an amazing scene in court. He said, how could something that no one's read, something that's in my closet, be you know, treasonous? And the judge said, never mind, you can't think it. Don't even think these thoughts, because the birds will carry them. Well, Algernon Sidney, certainly censorship worked against him. He was chopped in 4 pieces and put to death. Right. But that piece of work survived, found its way across the ocean, and it was metabolized by America's founders. And it was later called Blueprint for America's Revolution. So the fact that, you know, the fact that something is forbidden gives it a cachet, takes it further. In other cases, you know, there's always a way. There's always a way. In fact, even now, Communist China has this massive, astounding 10 million person plus system of censorship called the Great Firewall, which is a term. But Reporters Without Borders just found a way to route thousands of forbidden stories into China through the online game Minecraft. People began to record stories as Spotify lyrics. And so
Wow.
the Chinese government knows this, of course. And so censors are always in a spot because once they take a position, they can't back down. It just makes it worse. But, you know,
It's interesting.
Yeah.
There's a similar phenomenon recently. It's morphed a little bit. There was a similar phenomenon in Cuba where the internet was blocked, mostly by lack of access, right? They didn't even have to block it much. You just couldn't get onto it. And what the Cubans invented were relatives in Miami flying to Florida, to Cuba, with a USB hub full of stories, right? Information. And that hub would then circulate. And Cuban government knew very well, but how what do you do about that? And I was also interested that in your work, you argue that censorship is basically a class weapon. And I had not thought of it that way before. I usually thought of it as a product of religious ignorance or superstition or sectarianism or whatever. I'm sure those are mixed in, but what do you mean that it's an issue of social class as frequently as anything else?
Well, I think this builds on what we were just talking about. I think implicitly censors know that ideas can't really be eradicated. So quite a bit of censorship I found has been as much a question of channeling information as it is suppressing it. And when you're in a position of power, what you're trying to do is channel information away from those who might challenge that power. And it's really hardwired into American and British law, into classes needing to know their place and staying there. I mean, let's go back to a leader of thought, Thomas Paine. Let's go to his book, Age of Reason, which was a broadside against Christianity and a broadside against God and the church. And he said it's just one big oppression. Now, his works were prosecuted less for what they said than the fact that they were priced cheaply and directed to the poor. And in the early 19th century, when all these prosecutions happened, I mean, no one was really hiding it. All right, this is what was said in court, is that the gospel is preached for the benefit of the poor so that they could bear up under their misery, put up with it. No, honestly, I wish I had the quote here. Bear up under their misery, survive in hopes for a better life afterwards. And when that faith is challenged, the prosecutor said to the jury, "Oh my God, what is going to happen?" And so we see throughout, particularly the 19th century, because there were revolutions throughout the 19th century coming after the giant French Revolution, that the same book, let's say there was a book of Tolstoy's, the same book, the Kreutzer Sonata, when it's expensive, is allowed. When it's priced cheaply, it's not. And, the same play, when there was one play that was staged in Austria in a popular theater of King Lear. For our readers, for our watchers who don't know that, King Lear is about a king who goes berserk and, death ensues and craziness ensues, and he dies in a state of insanity in rags. Well, the authorities said, no, that's not going to work. You have to change. We don't want kings. We don't want kings dying around here. And so even though it made the play utterly insane and ridiculous, that had to change. I mean, there was another example, a birth control manual. This gets into sex, which is something that I wrote quite a bit about. A book called The Fruits of Philosophy. Basically, before there was birth control, there were crude forms. And there was this book knocking around England for 80 years in a very expensive form, counseling couples how to have sex for pleasure and not make children. Well, as soon as that book was reprinted cheaply for the poor, it was the subject of an obscenity prosecution, and they lost.
Well, sex seems to sex and writing about sex and portrayal of sex seems to have survived that attack rather well. Eric, let's jar the audience a little bit and take some of these historical concepts and put them live right now in our society. So let me ask you, let's just talk about America generally, and then we'll pull the microscope closer even still. What is the state of free speech in the United States? And I'll give you 2 points to push against briefly, because I want to flesh them both out. One, how is it compared to, say, 100 years ago in the United States? And how is it compared to the rest of the democratic world? And I refer mostly to Western Europe in this case.
Okay. I think we don't fully grasp it because we've always lived it, but this particular 60-odd year period, 50-odd year period, there's never been anything like it, really. We've never had a more freedom of speech, less government power to monkey with what we're saying, compared to 100 years ago. Astounding. In fact, 100 years ago is almost the perfect number, because around 1919, coming after World War I, is right when the Supreme Court, when it was affirming the convictions of people who were speaking out against the war, mostly socialists and minorities, was developing this idea of a marketplace of ideas, was developing this idea of freedom of speech. It took a while, but we're at a point now where one can actually brutally criticize the government, can brutally criticize what the government is doing without the risk of being jailed or thrown away. But there's a lot pulling against that. There's a lot pulling against that.
We'll come back to how do we compare to Western Europe? Or I think I think the greatest point of contrast might even be the United Kingdom, right?
The United Kingdom, and we could look towards Germany. There's a very different conception of speech there. Of course, every democratic government has freedom of speech enshrined in their documents. We all say that we love it. All the treaties and the conventions, but the European Convention on Human Rights will have Article 10 say we value freedom of speech and freedom of hearing it, but then the next section says except when necessary for a democratic society, except when hatred is promoted, except when divisiveness is promoted. So Europe, particularly Germany, and really coming on strong, the UK, they have adopted what I think a lot of Americans have adopted privately, is to use the law, to use the power of the government. And when I say the power of the government, I mean guns, and I mean jail, and I mean police, to curb speech that is offensive, to curb speech that hurts, to curb speech that expresses hatred. Europe's obviously had a little experience in the 40s that we didn't really touch on. And so there's a big divergence between America and Europe on how to deal with politically divisive speech and how to deal with emotionally divisive speech.
Right.
And America also, to jump back, I mean, we aren't quite so different, because in the private sphere and in the online sphere, which is managed by private companies, we've sort of, European standards seem to be slipping in through the side door.
Right. Well, yes.
In a major way.
Right. Well, just to load up the pitch here, as they say.
Load me up, Marc.
Right. Well, as you well know, in some of the Western European countries, hate speech laws, etc., what we would call hate speech laws, actually make it criminal to deny the Holocaust or to even display a swastika. There's all kinds of things that so far would be kind of unimaginable here, maybe not so much, because I don't think I'm speaking out of school to say the last number of years, there is sentiment in this country. There are people who would like to increase the prosecution of a speech they don't like, whether it's through the legal system or otherwise. Right now, it's difficult to do it through the legal system, though we see more and more hate speech laws. And personally, it's difficult to argue with people that hate speech laws might actually be censorious rather than liberatory.
What else are they?
I'm sorry?
I said, what else are they? When you're using the law to stop someone from
Well,
saying
well,
something,
let me
you're
play
censoring
devil's
them.
advocate. I'm not going to hide my own position, but devil's advocate. What's wrong with telling people? What's wrong with a hate law that makes it illegal to propose racial segregation or or uh, or something, or secession from the United States,
Or to say that a certain, or to say that a
class,
certain, to say that a certain group is inferior, or to say trans people should be excluded from this, that, or the other. Yeah. We've gone through a real transformation, both in this country and Europe, from seeing free speech and speech itself as an inherent good to seeing speech as something threatening. And I don't, or dangerous. I mean, threatening to our peace. That someone saying something, and I'm not denying the hurt. I mean, you have your soft spots, Marc. I'm sure I have my soft spots. They exist. And when I hear someone say something that touches close to home, I feel pain. I don't like it, and the part of me that I don't like wants to stop it. But in Europe, they have adopted the idea that quelling hate speech might in fact quell the hatred. And there's several reasons why, to answer your question directly, why the terrible things people say, why don't we outlaw them, and then they won't say them anymore, and then we won't hear this anymore? It seems easy enough. Well, in the first case, it doesn't work. Okay, you could put someone in jail, you could put a group of people in jail, but it's a fool's errand. You can't use even well-intentioned laws. Let's stay apart from some, which I will get to. It doesn't reduce the quantum of hatred. In fact, it only seems to move it elsewhere. And again, as we were talking about forbidden fruit, you create a lot of martyrs that didn't normally exist. And you also create quite a few victims, because those who are being accused of hate speech are often canceled or taken out very, very, very quickly. So we've now deputized, for example, both in this country and in Europe, the duty of the online platforms to get rid of hate speech and to get rid of millions and millions and millions of pieces. To think that that's being done in any way that is judicious or thoughtful, it's crazy. And so, even as the quantum of anti-Semitism or anti-immigrant sentiment goes up, it doesn't work. Second, hate speech, and I'll fold in fake news laws. It sounds like a nice thing. I wish I could get rid of this bad stuff. And a lot of countries have adopted it, but they use hate speech to quell dissent. Okay, that's how. Don't forget who's in power. Okay, if we had nice people in power who are doing things in a nice way, it might work. But there's only one thing to think of, which is Donald Trump, or the next Trump administration. When you have laws that can squelch speech, even when they sound good, I can go through it. I mean, France, very touchy about their relationship with Israel. People speak up for BDS, to boycott Israel. They're often put in jail. Turkey will put people in jail in fact, they do it for speaking out against the Kurds. Spain, yeah, which is we think of as a more democratic country, if you speak for Basque independence on Twitter, you will find the police on your door.
Right.
It goes back to Mandela, to Gandhi. So when we have these laws, we have to think of how they're used and who's using them. And the third point is that it goes to overreach. When you outlaw hate speech, you end up outlawing a whole lot more than the worst messages. The UK you just mentioned, I mean, they've got a new law coming online, which is going to be ridiculous. Is not only would they require the online platforms to get rid of hate speech as is defined in British law, which is, not ridiculous, but also what they call lawful but awful speech that might be legal, but cause someone psychological pain. Now, if Mark Zuckerberg you think is kind of a jerk, and you think that his company doesn't do things right, why would we give them more power to do that?
Right.
It,
Well,
it doesn't work.
I was going to bring that up because, as we speak today, the Senate is considering the commission on January 6th, and the airwaves are full of that. And I have been listening for a couple of days now about how the major culprit, or one of the major culprits in the January 6th assault, was social media and Facebook. And then you hear a lot of people, including liberals who have been historically on the side of more speech rather than less, vociferously. That's turned around with political correctness, because I think liberals are just as quick to excoriate people that they don't want to hear as the other side is. That's my view. You can rebut that. But the focus on social media is to my mind, rather, not that I'm a big defender of Mark Zuckerberg, but there's more complex things at play here in the society than just Facebook, though it does have an enormous impact. So all of that mumbling to say to you, it seems to me that government repression of speech is not immediately on the agenda, except on the margins with some of this hate speech stuff. But regulation of social media, which would be a form of, could be considered a form of restriction of speech, is now front and center. I don't know that that's going to happen, but it's certainly a completely legitimate idea now. If you walk around and say, we should, force Facebook to do this, or we should do this or that with Twitter, or we should keep, Donald Trump off of Twitter and Facebook forever. What is your view of that? Is there anything there that's legit? Or are they dreaming?
I think a lot of it is grandstanding because it sounds good. And so there's, I don't know how many dozen bills floating around this. There was just one passed in Florida, which will be declared unconstitutional probably before this interview is over, because it's effing absurd. You when you have the government, well, first off, let's just set things up a little bit. The government is virtually powerless to regulate speech with with very, very few exceptions.
Right.
Under the private realm, in your house, in this room, we are dictators. And so we have kind of an apotheosis of that, which with the platforms being private. Okay. So until we rethink the First Amendment fundamentally, laws that tell the platforms what to do with speech are restrictions on speech and should be declared unconstitutional. That's pretty basic stuff. But I also think that our society, I'm 62 years old. I was a child during the civil rights era. I'm a grown up now. I do sense, as do you, that we are in a particularly divided state. But to put it all on social media, Zuckerberg is an easy guy to loathe. So is Dorsey. These are good hate symbols. But to say that the chaos and the dissension and all of that in society is because of the platforms is, I think, grandstanding. Yes, they amplify, and we could talk about how to fix that. Well, but
I also think that, and I'd like you to address this, it's also, I think, lost in this. You've written about censorship. I have been a journalist and a professor of journalism. 10, 12, 15 years ago, there was a very different view of Facebook and social media, which was this was a battering ram against censorship and against kind of concentrated control of information. We had freedom of the press, for 200 years here, but nobody had a press, or one in 50,000 people had a press. Now you turn on your phone and you can broadcast, right? Whether you have an audience or not is something else. But is not there a positive side to social media in terms of empowering people and democratizing information? That's kind of the flip side of the negatives that are so prevalent right now are so easy to see?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, I mean, social media, in fact, the internet itself is, and they blend. It's not like there's an internet and then there's social media and there's the good part and then there's the bad part. Look, the world's transformed. It's how it is. I mean, you and I have in our pockets production studios of pretty damn good quality. And if someone wants to listen. Now, 10 or 15 years ago, we also thought of the internet as being an instrument for democracy, an instrument to break down, the Arab Spring, et cetera. Right. Clinton had that now sounding ridiculous comment that, this would break down the Chinese dictatorship, that for the Chinese to try and regulate the internet would be like nailing Jell-O to a wall. Well, right. The Chinese learned to nail Jell-O to any wall they wanted to quite well. What the difference is between 10 or 15 years ago and now is, I think, we have to realize that, yes, every time, the social media is astoundingly positive in 100 ways. But at the same time, every little spat, every little, blow up, every scandal, every misinformation is money. The algorithms and the way that the platforms are set up is we're always monetized. And so what's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is this vast public square that the Supreme Court was so excited about in the Reno case about 15 years ago, and et cetera, and the vast marketplace of ideas, the superstore of ideas that anyone could speak in. What we've done is we've now become, rather than speakers, it's better to think of us as users. It's better to think of us as assets to Zuckerberg and the shareholders of Twitter. We're all working for him, okay? Everything we do, we're tracked, we're monetized, and so no one's going to look at my or yours or whoever else's production because our speech is getting channeled to the most sympathetic audiences. And so, I find myself, I've got very liberal ideas. It's not a secret. I don't get a lot of Biden's taking away your gun stories. They don't get routed to me. I get stories that are routed to me that tell me that the enemies I hate are that much worse than I ever thought. And that I'm much smarter than I ever thought I was. And so what we needed to do to help clean up the environment is try to get to the model rather than the speech itself. And we could talk about that.
Well, Senator Berkowitz, in the remaining moments we have, how would you deal with the Facebook issue policy-wise? I mean, I think you do have some ideas, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't claim to be original on this, but I think on the right and the left, everybody claims to be free speech. Everybody claims to be against censorship, but they're both looking for it in a big way. So when we pass laws telling the platforms to regulate speech in a certain way or not to amplify speech in a certain way, in 5 years or 4 years, that's going to be struck down. So what I think the best idea is really to get to our privacy. It is astounding. We've all experienced it, where you've said something or you've done something, and all of a sudden ads start showing up or stories start showing up. I mean, Facebook will know you're pregnant before your husband does, okay? And so what I think the best solution, which might pass muster in the courts, which matters, is to pass privacy laws which forbid the platforms from sucking up our personal data and using that to target advertising. Okay, I don't mind the ads I can pay attention to, but what's that's done is created an architecture where we are being fed the craziest, most affirming stuff, affirming our own internal craziness to keep us on platform as long as we can so they'll sell us ads. I think that would really, if we bar the use of personal data to target ads, that would rejigger the platforms and sort of get the platforms where they breathe, honestly. And I think it would go a long way. It wouldn't stop hatred or craziness. Hatred or craziness existed before, it's going to exist after, but it would, I think, turn the volume down quite a bit and maybe even make it through the courts because it wouldn't be a specific speech law.
Yeah, even though that's becoming more of a guessing game too. I think I know we have a bunch of questions. I don't know if Jennifer wants to join us and help manage those. Are you there, Jennifer?
Hello, Jennifer.
Yes.
Do I ever want to join you? My goodness, though, I don't want this conversation to end. It's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you both.
Just begun here, unfortunately.
I think that's going to have to become a series. You two just have to keep coming back. And of course, these issues are very germane to the Mark Twain House and to Mark Twain's legacy, and particularly with Huckleberry Finn and the use of the N-word and the many continued bannings of Huckleberry Finn by libraries and school systems throughout its history. So you're not here by accident. And I see you both making knowing kind of head shaking. Did you like to talk about that a little bit?
Well, there's a certain word that's used in Huckleberry Finn about 1,600 times, which that word, which I'm not going to say because you can't say it, and not that I would want to, but we've gotten to the point, Mark and I touched on this early, is where feelings matter more than freedom. And I think our speech setup in this country, and it's unique and it's marvelous, and I don't want to give it up, which is that we have the responsibility to take our lumps on hearing words that we don't want to hear in order to let minorities speak. Don't ever forget who's enforcing the laws. And I mean, I think Twain, by using that word as brutally as he did, was making a point, and it wasn't an easy point to swallow. And we're at a point now where, I mean, I'm no defender of that word, but I'm the defender of the ability to say things that hurt, to make points. And we're at a point now where I was just talking about this with Marc a little while ago, where in law, I'm a lawyer, in law school classes, it's now becoming verboten to pronounce a word even after an appellate judge has said it in a court case, that word and several others, the words have become poisonous and radioactive. And so a law professor cannot teach a class involving cases in that word involving discrimination because we can't hear it. And I think that's just wrong. Okay, let's just say it. In fact, one professor was reprimanded, and I think he might have been fired for in an exam, he used N plus a dash on an exam question in a case involving discrimination. And okay, I understand. I'm not denying the pain that a person might feel seeing that or what it might evoke. I'm not saying you don't feel pain, get over it. But I'm saying at the same time, I think speech should prevail. Let's put it like that.
Well, can I put a coda on that?
Yeah.
As a journalist, I think that the banning of words like which in the N-word and Huckleberry Finn, etc., and then the banning of a book because it's in there is actually a gateway drug, if you will. That's the easiest way to censor something, is to pull something off a library shelf or to pull it out of publication. What concerns me is what is the next step? What is the next step in censorship? And that is when people do not use banned or ugly or hurtful words, but where the listener interprets what the other person says as having deep negative meaning, and therefore that person is X, Y, or Z. He or she is a racist, a homophobe, a fascist, a communist, whatever, right? And is canceled if the other party has the power to cancel. And
I think we have to think of context.
Yeah.
Context.
Well,
of course. I mean, I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. We could talk all night just about that, in fact, but
it's an electric issue.
It is,
and it matters deeply.
Yeah.
So we actually have more kind of commenty things than questions in here. So I'm going to go with Dr. Wesley B's statement question. Suppression of politically incorrect speech, etc., is a clear form of social control. Yes?
Yes. John Stuart Mill, the great political philosopher from the 19th century, who was worth reading, had a lot of good points to make. And his main point that most people know about is even suppressing one idea, even if it's a minority, if it's one out of 1,000, that shouldn't happen because that guy could be right or that woman could be right. Truth changes. But he also talked about what's called social tyranny, which is the tyranny of the majority. And by majority, he didn't just mean majority in numbers, those who speak the loudest. And that's a form of censorship through social intimidation, through ostracism, and through the loudest minority, or the majority, bullying authorities to shut someone up. And in this case, I forgot the gentleman's name who put in that comment question. We're seeing that, in a very, very big way, where every 3 days we'll hear about someone who says something or has written something 5 years ago or whatever, like this woman from Teen Vogue, or Emily, the woman from the AP who was just zapped for her pro-Palestinian activities. And so what we have is the tyranny of the loudest minority bullying authorities, be it AP or a university or an employer or anyone else, to cancel, and I'll use the word, I don't like the word, but to erase that person, take that person off the public sphere because of what they said. And that is, the authorities, be it the university or Google or whatever, are simply managing business. I don't think they particularly give a damn one way or the other. They're just trying to get through the day. And when they have a petition of 1,600 people saying, get rid of this person or we're going to go, we're going to all write op-eds, we're all going to bother you, they're doing what they feel they have to do. There are organizations defending people like that, but in answer to this person's question, the answer is yes. Is it classic censorship by the government? Not always. No, but I've expanded my own view of censorship in writing this book.
But the net effect of that phenomenon, is precisely to restrict public debate, and it doesn't only moderate the debate. It doesn't only put limits on the debate. It actually influences the collective view of something, because these things become consensual, right?
Why would you publish a paper on something that you know is going to draw you fire for the rest of your life? And it's happening also on the governmental level as well. I mean, there's I don't know how many bills in state legislatures, and also I think on the federal level also, to stop divisive language in universities. And that divisive language is teaching the pervasiveness of slavery in American history off the 1619 Project, et cetera. Right. So under the guise of keeping out divisiveness, we're just molding history in the way that we want. This is why, the absolutist model of the United States, it hurts, it's chaotic, it causes misery. It's hell to get through, but the alternatives are a hell of a lot worse, because when you give people power, even when it's dressed up in a beautiful suit of clothes, I'm just trying to keep people nice, it invariably goes wrong. The woman who just managed the 1619 Project was denied tenure at her university for that.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Actually, I don't want to dwell on it because we should be focusing on your book. Actually, that is a double whammy, that case, because
I know.
More information's come out, and she actually accepted. I think that's a good way. That case of Nicole Hannah Jones is a good way to see both sides of this issue, right? Because
everything's complicated. Yeah.
Everything's complicated because she has also been party to deplatforming.
Would you, for readers who are not, readers, but audience members who might not be fully aware, could you just give us a quick précis of that situation? And
Sure. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's fascinating, and I think it's a good thing to talk about.
There was a colossal and astounding, very controversial piece of journalism done in the New York Times about a year ago called the 1619 Project, which is 1619 is the first year that slaves were brought to North America. And the project is multimedia and it's astounding, and it basically it views American history through a direct lens of slavery and how the legacy of slavery remains till the present. And, of course, the scholarship was attacked by both the left and the right.
Mm.
Of course, it's controversial. That means it's good, okay? And the woman who managed the whole project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, pretty accomplished woman, is a journalist and had a position, a pretty nice position at her alma mater, the University of North Carolina. And she accepted a position with tenure, and it was just denied because of that. What Marc was just talking about, which is interesting, is there was this Don McNeil, another New York Times journalist.
Not only him, but he's the most egregious case.
Yeah, I mean, he was fired for words he said on a trip with students to Peru. And this woman, Nicole Hannah-Jones, was sort of part, I think, I'm not sure of this, but I think took part in the effort to take this guy out for what he said in Peru. So, I mean, goose meet gander, you know, when we get into a culture where we're, excuse me, Marc, just one second. When we get into a culture where we're targeting people, this is what online work can do, targeting people, gathering up a group, saying that person is wrong, that person needs to be denied either a job or a benefit or whatever. A very rough form of justice or injustice is going to result from that.
If you'll allow me, I want to add to that by bringing out another aspect to it, right? Which is, and this is difficult. It's a subtle aspect, but I want to hit on it, right? I agree with everything you said about her and the project, though I'm not as enthusiastic about the project. That's my view.
I thought it was amazing. Yeah.
It was amazing in its scope. I didn't particularly cotton to her essay, but it doesn't matter. It's my opinion. It doesn't matter. It's an enormous and admirable piece of work, and certainly has a net positive effect. But all I wanted to say was, as a university professor, I know this sounds petty, but you know the questions of tenure are very, very complicated at a university. In fact, Eric, when you were at the University of Southern California, the director of the journalism department had just left being the editor of the Los Angeles Times, had won a Pulitzer Prize, and he did not get tenure. They had to really fight for a year and a half because books published in the popular culture and that win Pulitzer Prizes are not considered to be peer-reviewed and good enough for tenure, right? And in Nicole's case, turns out she actually accepted the job after it was clear that she wasn't going to get tenure. What I find interesting about that is that the public reaction to the case was, in the current atmosphere we're in, well, of course she didn't get tenure because all university administrators are white racists and they punished her for this, right? Now, there was a campaign against her by a couple of top Republicans connected to the university. But it's always more complicated. It's not just, the university said, we're not going to give this person tenure. The university, you have to pull tenure from their teeth. And it's just a minor point, but it's one that I think bears repeating. You can't always, I could boil that down to say, you can't judge a book by its cover, right? There's always another 500 pages behind it. But
let's take another question.
Well, let's see. I think there's only one more, but I have another question. May I?
Of course.
Because I'm curious and always have been about kind of the nomenclature. So there's censorship and there's banning and there's suppression and there's people just writing nasty comments in the comments section and stuff. Can you just talk a little bit about the range of things that we broadly call censorship that might not actually fall into the narrow definition of censorship?
Okay. When I started this project a couple years ago, the first thing I tried to figure out is what the hell I was talking about. Honestly, I spent several days trying to figure out what the hell censorship is. And the most narrow definition is let's go to the Chinese emperor, when the government punishes you, often in a criminal way, or the church, for example, for something you've said, or prevents you from saying something that you want to say through licensing or these other things that existed for centuries. We never even got to. But censorship, the definition has expanded wildly in the popular imagination over the past decades for good and bad reasons. It's almost, we've seen censorship even through silencing, through a person who's in a minority who feels unsure about their place when they see someone from the majority figuratively manspreading, figuratively, asserting themselves so that they feel like they can't say what they want to say. They feel silenced. They feel intimidated. That's now being called censorship. Is it? I don't know. When we see censorship so hardwired into the way society is, which is what I'm getting to, it's gone from a very narrow to a very broad definition, then it almost becomes normalized. Then it's like, what the hell? What's the big deal? Why even stop? And so what's going on now is I think people feel silenced from a number of different directions, and they're looking to all places to the government to protect them from the censorship of others, which is what gets the hate speech.
Or to
universities or their employer.
Right.
So what they're saying is, you government or figure of authority who was always the oppressor, now I'm looking at you, I'm trying to enlist authority to protect me against this person. And
right.
That is, if there's anything, if you're ever playing with fire, you ask a government to help you on the way you speak. So censorship doesn't have a definition. It's what we call it at this point.
Do you think that, can I ask another question?
Of course, please do.
Eric, do you think that given the current atmosphere, it's hard, you've got the historical perspective, which is really important. Most of us don't in our daily lives, we think what we see is what we have forever and what has always been.
We also think that we're experiencing everything for the first time. Like
exactly.
This is never happened,
so,
oh my God. Yeah.
Right. So apart from the specific anecdotes, the social forces that are in play here are what really call my attention, because my non-expert view of American history is that what we broadly call, liberal forces have been the engine of progress and achievement in the United States, at least in the cultural area, in the areas of expression, et cetera. That base seems eroded to a great degree now. Maybe, and I don't know if that's momentary or not, but I'd be interested in your view. Do you think we're losing the capacity among the key players here, among the key social forces that would defend speech? Are we losing them to this kind of political correctness or oversensitivity, whatever you want to call it, restriction?
Well, I think we're very polarized. I mean, that's no comment. That's no genius comment. And so we're at a stage where when the other side is saying something, we're automatically against it. So when the likes of Donald Trump or Josh Hawley or very far right politicians are saying, I'm a defender of free speech, or when a large corporation assumes the mantle of free speech, then those on the other side say, well, that can't be all right, And so I think that traditionally, and this gains for free speech have been made at the expense of the rich and powerful, and they never came easily, and they always came after some blood was shed and some lives were ruined. And so when the rich and powerful now use free speech, cloak what they're doing, which is the same old thing, in free speech, then I think there's a bit of a snookering going on. And I don't really see a huge support for, if we say that, as Justice Holmes said, we have to protect the thoughts we hate as much as the thoughts we love, I'm not feeling a lot of support for the thoughts we hate. I know myself, okay, when I hear, I identify very strongly with being Jewish. When I hear anti-Semitism, I'm jarred. I don't like it. But there's another part of me that says, well, okay, then we can't outlaw anti-Semitic speech because the next step is going to be the speech that I want to say. So I said it earlier. An environment that allows us to say what we wish to say is an environment that is not comfortable. We have to learn to metabolize that discomfort. Know that we're going to walk around with a pebble in our shoe, with a big pebble in our shoe that's sharp, it's worth it because we could still walk.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. Jennifer, how are we doing on time? I think
Well, we are just about out of time, and I have to say that might have been the very best way to end this conversation with that idea that you just expressed. And that's something I'm going to give a lot of thought to moving forward. So, gosh, I could have spent another hour or two listening to the two of you talk, though, and I hope that you'll come to the Mark Twain House in Hartford in person one of these days, and we'll continue the conversation then. It's been so fascinating.
Can I just make one last comment?
No, I'm censoring you.
Come on. The people at the Mark Twain House have been fabulous, and you're a great group. And if you guys have the slightest interest in buying this stupid book, get it through the Mark Twain House, because they'll get a few dollars and they need it.
And
Thank you so much for that.
And I will say that to the folks listening, with complete sincerity, you should buy the book. It's a great book. Eric is very talented. Not only is he an awesome journalist, and now we can even call him a historian, he's also a very gifted writer. It's a very good read. I read it 2.5 times, and there aren't many books that fall into that category.
All right. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you for that support from both of you, and thank you for absolutely fascinating Thursday evening. You've made my week. So please don't be strangers. We'll hope to have you here, as I said, in person one of these days. And folks, buy the book. There's the link in the chat. And thank you for your good participation and good questions and everything. So good luck with your power outage there, Mark. And
Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks a lot, Jen.
No problem.
Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.